The Magic in the Marrow by Tygermine. Chapter 5. I always have your back. Hermione was sitting on a beach chair, the turquoise ocean a wetter version of the sky. There was a familiar song playing in the background as she tilted her hat to soak up the sunshine. A male figure emerged from the waves reminiscent of a Bond film she'd seen many years ago. The figure made its way up to her, all lean muscles and completely naked. He stopped at the foot of her beach chair. "DCI Hale!" she exclaimed. "You're naked, and very happy to see me."
"I felt the need to apologize to you."
"By all means," she purred, as DCI Hale dropped to his knees and ran his hands up her legs until his fingers hooked into her bikini bottom, pulling it down past her feet. He set up the beach chair, lying on his stomach, his face up close and personal to her thoughts, her legs draped over his shoulders. As he began to lick and suckle at her lips, Hermione felt a growing sense of dread. Something about this was off. It all felt very wrong. A phone began to ring on the table beside her. DCI Hale was still between her legs, yet she couldn't feel him. As she answered the phone, the scenery swirled around her, changing in a kaleidoscope until it settled into Malfoy's office. He was seated behind his desk, elbows resting on a wooden surface, fingers steepled.
"The Muggle detectives are not our friends. Do you know the punishment for traitors?"
"I'm not a traitor," she snapped, feeling her nipples harden against her bikini top. They were the only traitors here. Malfoy stood up and rounded his desk to stand in front of her.
"Well,"
he raised an eyebrow,
"I'm awfully tired from catching murderous doctors, so the least you can do is undress me."
"No."
"No?"
Hermione removed her bikini top, dropping it on the floor, and crowded Malfoy against the desk, caging him in with her arms on either side of him. She leaned against him until they were touching along the full length of her body. Her eyes were level with his collarbone, so she knocked his knees outwards until she was level with his chin. She ran her nose along the exposed skin of his neck, above the collar of his shirt, until the tip of her nose brushed against his earlobe. She smirked at the sharp breath he inhaled. "You smell like metal and gunpowder," she murmured, then licked along the thrumming vein on his neck. You taste like the ocean, but sweet, like licking an ice cream cone on the beach." While she spoke, she pulled down the zip of his trousers and carefully pulled out his stiff cock. Hermione tightened her fingers around its girth and slid her fist along its length, his hips canting to chase the clench of her fist. She teasingly scolded him, releasing his cock and stepping back. "I want you at my back." He grabbed her hand and pulled her towards the desk, bending her over, his hand holding her down by tangling his fingers in her curls. He lined himself up and leaned over her to whisper in her ear. "I always have your back." He punctuated this by thrusting deep into her. "Harder," she begged, despite the table digging painfully into her hips. "Harder." Malfoy let go of her head, and with both hands on her shoulders, he pushed into her in a ferocious rhythm. Hermione woke up with a gasp and a throb in her core. The sun had just begun to lighten the sky when Hermione let herself into the lab. Her dream had left her with such a need, spent 20 minutes in the shower making very good use of the detachable shower head. Unfortunately, there wasn't so much an afterglow as an aftergloom as she once again spiraled around her body's attraction to Malfoy. Unable to sleep, she decided to go to work. With a flick of her wand, she activated the coffee machine as she made her way to the workbench. There was a pink glow hovering over her sample. The results were inconclusive. With an irritated grunt, she balled up the printout and lobbed it towards the bin. "Ow!" Hermione startled and turned towards the noise. Malfoy stood a few feet from the workbench, rubbing his forehead.
"So the stakeout was fruitless," he grouched, "and the coffee shop isn't open yet."
"What are you doing here? I'm sure you have an office. In fact, I've been to it, so I know it exists." Malfoy's hand moved from his forehead to the nape of his neck, and he couldn't meet her eye.
"This is a dodgy neighborhood, so I have a tracking charm on the lab in case someone breaks in."
"I have nothing to report regarding my analysis," she replied, sidestepping any emotion his explanation dredged up. Malfoy dropped his hand and leaned against the workbench across from her.
How is he able to leave such little evidence? It's like he knows what we will look for.
I hate to consider it, but he is as skilled as I am. Malfoy caught her eye, his own red with exhaustion.
No one is as skilled as you are, he declared, then seemed to sink into himself, his locked elbows the only thing stopping him from collapsing. I need coffee.
You need sleep. Use a sofa in my office. I gave Malcolm the day off to recover from your wild goose chase, so I'll be the only one here for the next few hours. The fact that he didn't utter a single objection to her suggestion was a testament to how tired he actually was, and without argument disappeared into her office. Hermione summoned a cup of coffee from her coffee machine and settled at her workbench. She must have been missing something, and if she was, that meant they'd overlooked it during their initial examination. With a sigh, she pulled on her latex gloves and began to redo every test they'd conducted. Auror Caxton clutched a satchel, holding her findings tightly as she hovered near the door to Auror Inspector Malfoy's office. Her skin tingled from the excessive amounts of pepper potion she'd consumed the previous night. Auror Inspector Malfoy's door was ajar, and she could see him hunched over his desk, quill almost flying over the parchment as he worked on various reports. The cause for hesitation was his thunderous mutterings as he worked, and her findings were not going to improve his mood.
Auror Caxton, do you have a reason for haunting my doorway?
Malfoy's tone was testy. Auror Caxton stumbled to the door, pushing it open, and entered the office the same way one walked up to a guillotine. Malfoy threw down his quill and pinned her with a frustrated glare.
What?
The demand was terse. So, with the staker not being successful, I had an idea and, the thing is, something about the killer skill set got me thinking. For someone to learn Muggle autopsy skills, they must have trained somewhere, and it's not common for witches or wizards to go train in the Muggle world. Most just train as healers here at St. Mungo's. Malfoy began to massage his temples.
Your point.
Dr. Granger's our most likely suspect. She spoke so quickly, Malfoy thought he'd misheard her. His silence forced her to explain herself. She fits the profile. She has Muggle training, magical training, and is an expert in the field of anatomy. Auror Caxton felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room following her statement. Auror Inspector Malfoy sat frozen for what felt like an ice age, until slowly he began to nod his head.
Let's say you're right, and it is Granger behind the murders. What would you claim are her motives?
His voice was low and steady, tightly controlled. Dr. Granger was in the last war as an active participant. There is no record of her attending any counseling afterwards. My psychological profile of her points to latent PTSD and possible dissociative disorder, so she may commit the crimes in a fugue state prior to the first victim being found and Spliff being called to assist us. Dr. Granger was working on mapping the magic genome. For this research, she requires the DNA of Muggles. Malfoy nodded at her explanation, but didn't respond. Auror Caxton found herself twitching with anxiety as she waited for him to voice his opinion on the matter. He slowly sat back in his chair and gave her a speculative look.
I'm sure you've heard of my involvement in the last war.
Malfoy's voice was soft.
I refused counseling afterwards as well. I still have the dark mark on my arm, and I know many non-magical ways to disarm and kill someone. Does your little psychological profile have me on the suspect list? Do I also tick all the PTSD boxes?
The thing is, you're not trained in Muggle surgery, which removed your name from the list, Auror Caxton admitted. But your profile did have a few red flags. Basically, we're glad you're on our side, but you do have the potential to go dark side.
Potential? I like that word. Apply to Granger and see what you come up with. You'll find she is not the killer, though she has the potential to become one.
With all due respect, Auror Inspector, your affection for Dr. Granger compromises your objectivity in this case, now that she's a suspect. Malfoy's eyebrows reached his hairline.
My affections for Dr. Granger?
Auror Caxton shrugged and pushed through with her assessment. Yes, we are all well aware that you harbor romantic feelings for Dr. Granger. Anyone who is a worthy Auror can spot the signs. But in this instance, it works against you, not for you. The head Auror will want you removed from the case as you are emotionally compromised.
And have you brought your theories to the head Auror yet?
Auror Caxton nodded. I had to give him a written copy of my findings.
How long?
You have 3 hours before they can issue a warrant of arrest for her.
That's enough time.
Malfoy stood from his chair and grabbed his coat on his way out of the office, pausing at the door to turn back to Auror Caxton.
Remind me to commend you on excellent detective work after this has been settled. But you still need to learn a lot about people. Psychology isn't definitive, but open to misinterpretation.
With that, he disappeared down the passage. Auror Caxton exhaled loudly and slumped into a chair facing the desk. She had never felt this bad about doing a good job. Hermione and Malcolm were reviewing the various test results and comparing notes when Malfoy stormed into the lab. He went straight to Hermione's office, grabbed her bag and coat, and walked back out to the examination area where the other two were standing.
"Malfoy, what are you doing?"
Hermione asked as Malfoy handed her the bag and the coat.
"No time to explain. We need to leave immediately."
"And go where exactly? Another body? Did you find the killer? Oh, Malcolm, hand me the results from the
No time, Granger. We need to leave now."
He took her by the elbow and began to lead her to the door. Hermione resisted, digging in her heels.
"Malfoy, I can't just go with you on your little jaunts. I have work to do." "They think it's you,"
he exploded at her before reining himself in.
"They think you're the killer,"
he said softly, eyes darting around.
"They're coming to arrest you."
Hermione stood stock still, her eyes searching his face for any hint that this was a trick, some poorly timed prank. All she saw was a pair of silver-grey eyes pleading with her to trust him. With a nod, she turned to Malcolm. "Duplicate our findings and hide a copy somewhere safe. Hand over everything else when they come for me."
"But, Dr. Granger, can't you just explain that it isn't you?"
"Malcolm, consider the evidence. I'm a very good candidate for suspicion, so I'm not really surprised that they decided it was me. Keep working the case from your side, and I'll do the same from mine. Don't give them the phone unless they explicitly ask for it." Malcolm nodded, his face pale and stricken as Hermione left the lab with Malfoy. The pair made their way to Muggle London and found a pub in Islington that rented out rooms. Once ensconced in the room above the pub, Hermione began to slowly freak out.
"Did you even bother to tell them I'm not the killer?" "I did, but according to them, because I brought you in as my consultant, I was objectively compromised."
"That doesn't make any sense."
"Naming you as the killer doesn't make sense. Caxton's entire case is based on circumstantial evidence and psychology."
"Psychology? You've turned me into a fugitive because of psychology. What the fuck, Malfoy?"
"It doesn't sound right when you swear."
"Oh, I have an arsenal of swear words to pull from. Motherfucker. There's a good one that rolls off the tongue. That motherfucking killer is going to rot in Azkaban for the rest of their lives when I'm through with this case."
"That's the spirit. Now, what do we actually have to work with?"
"You're a fugitive too, aren't you?" Hermione sank down onto the bed in the middle of the room.
"Just suspiciously AWOL, really."
Malfoy waved a hand as if it wasn't a serious offense he was committing that could cost him his career.
"I know you're innocent. You give me the evidence to prove it, and I'll get you back to your normal life."
"You have my back?" she asked softly, not daring to catch his eye, as her dream pushed at the edges of her mind, demanding to be recalled. Malfoy sat down next to her and took her hand in both of his, the long fingers almost dwarfing her own.
"Always, Granger."
She took a deep, calming breath, catching hints of Malfoy's scent as he sat next to her. Sandalwood, satsuma, and cinnamon faded into gunpowder. A metal tang spread across her tongue. "Gunpowder? Why gunpowder?"
"I don't know, Granger. Why don't you tell me?"
"That's what the residue was in some of the nicks we found. Gunpowder, metal shavings." She pushed her tongue against her hard palate, trying to scrape the taste of metal off her tongue. "I was about to map it when you pulled me from my lab." Malfoy dipped his head to acknowledge her disapproval at his early actions.
"Bygones, Granger. We need to catch the killer now. Gunpowder. Where are they manufacturing gunpowder in London?"
"Nowhere. Not anymore. And the analysis showed the ingredients were old, at least 100 years, based on the degradation of the saltpeter in the samples."
"Where did Muggles used to produce gunpowder around 100 years ago? In London along the Thames?"
"They didn't. Gunpowder production in London stopped in the mid-Victorian era," Hermione replied, but her mind was already running a mile a minute, going through every bit of historical trivia she'd collected over her lifetime. Malfoy leaned back on his elbows, his forehead scrunched in concentration.
"I don't think you were wrong about Canning Town. I was wrong about the self-storage unit. He's not using them because he's not at ground level. He's underground. Considering how many layers the city has, I wouldn't be surprised. What we need is an old map of the city, and I know exactly where to get one. Hermione looked over her shoulder at him and smiled. She's not here. Malcolm didn't bother to look up from his microscope as Auror Caxton entered the lab with a fellow Auror, who stood a good foot taller than her and outweighed her by at least 25 pounds in pure muscle. So you know why I'm here? Her nose was tilted up, as if it added to her authority. Malcolm rolled his chair away from the workbench and crossed his arms to glare at her. I heard you may be stopping by sometime today. Where is she? She didn't say where she was going, only that she had to pop out for a bit. I hope she comes back soon. I asked her to pick up a kebab for me, and I'm getting a bit hungry now. Malcolm scratched at his eyebrow with his middle finger. You're being childish. I need to know where Hermione Granger has gone. Malcolm stood up and walked over to a different workbench. He made a show of gathering documents and printouts, shuffling them, rearranging them, and then sliding them into folders. I honestly have no idea. It's not like she has to report to me. The opposite, in fact. He picked up a handful of folders and ambled over to Auror Caxton. This is all our forensics findings so far. As Auror Caxton reached for them, Malcolm held the files back. What do you want with Dr. Granger anyway? We have a warrant for her arrest. Well, that's a bad idea. Caxton bristled with indignation. It's not personal. Dr. Granger matches the psychological profile of a killer. You're trying to arrest my boss, and you're saying it's not personal, and your entire argument rests on psychology, which we both know is not a real science. Here. He dropped the files into her hands. Some real scientific evidence to prove that your warrant is worth less than yesterday's newspaper. Malcolm, Just go. There's nothing for you here. With that, Malcolm headed up to the break room. He really needed a cup of coffee. Of all the miles of underground passages and tunnels, why would you choose the one that doubled as a sewer? Malfoy kept walking, refusing to acknowledge his cock-up and choosing that particular tunnel. He had meant for them to take a different tunnel, one that was built separately from the sewer system. After a visit to the British Archives, where Hermione had standing access, they discovered that there were ancient Roman tunnels that linked the various tube routes, as well as other basements, into one long rat maze. Hermione had pointed out that it would be easy for the killer to remove his victim from the train if he apparated with them into the nearest side tunnel. The magic given off would cause all nearby electronics to stutter for a few moments, which most people would attribute to being underground. Also, most passengers on the tube did not pay attention to anything around them, preferring to keep their eyes on their phone and their earphones firmly lodged in their ears in case someone dares to speak to them. Working backwards, they found a route from Canning Town right up into Notting Hill. The route crossed the tube lines where the victims had gone missing. They were now on a mission to find the killer's secret lair. Stop calling it a lair, Hermione growled. We're not in a comic book. It's an underground room where a killer does evil things, ergo a lair. That's not how you use ergo. That's not how you use your face. Malfoy descended into a child at this point. He blamed the fumes from the sewer. Hermione dug an elastic band out of her bag and tied her hair up in a messy knot on the top of her head. If we'd taken the right turn back there, I'm sure we would have found the location by now. The map clearly showed a cross path up ahead. We can use that to get to the other tunnel. I'm starting to wish I'd let Caxton arrest me. You're no good to me in a holding cell, Granger. Look, here's a cross path, see? He pointed to an opening on the right wall and hopped over the stream of sewerage to explore it. Waving the torch, Hermione had insisted they buy before going below ground. Do you smell any gunpowder down here? Hermione asked, stepping up close behind him. Malfoy considered her question. You know what? I have no idea what gunpowder is supposed to smell like. Rotten eggs mixed with something metal? She pushed past him into the tunnel, her own torch lighting up her path. Oh, well, that narrows it down. They walked on for another hour before Hermione stopped short, examining the walls closely. This brick is odd. How so? Malfoy had learned not to dismiss her when she said the word odd. This section of the tunnels were constructed in the early 18th century, right? But this brick doesn't match the materials used at the time. She broke off a crumbly corner and licked it. Granger, you don't know where that brick has been.
complained Malfoy. "This brick is at least from the 12th century. This whole wall is, but it's not on any record we found." Narrowing her eyes, Hermione pressed against the bricks, selecting random petals until she heard something click. The wall pulled away and to the side. Malfoy was about to congratulate Hermione when 2 bolts of bright blue light came flying out of the dark and knocked him unconscious. Chapter 6. Bow chicka wow wow. Auror Inspector Malfoy woke up with a shooting pain that felt like a needle had been pushed through his left eye and was currently poking around in his brain. He grunted as he tried to move into a more comfortable position, which caused his body to alert him to all the other injuries he'd sustained. "What you're doing is despicable. This violates the very nature of scientific inquiry." Hermione's voice gave him something to focus on, and he pulled himself up into a seated position. His arms and legs were bound, and the seat of his trousers was uncomfortably damp where he'd been left in a puddle. The ice-cold water made soft slopping sounds as he moved. "How's that saying? You can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs." The male voice had an odd accent Malfoy couldn't place. He cracked open his eyelids, wincing as the pain in his head went up a few notches. The room they were in was dark, except for a single pool of light in the center of an examination table. Hermione was standing at the table talking to someone on the other side of it. A body lay on the table between them. "You can't dismiss this," the man said. "It's your idea after all." "My idea?" "Yes. Everyone has been talking about your groundbreaking study into the magic genome, but it's not just DNA, it's actual physiology as well." "My test subjects willingly donate DNA samples. I don't need to kill them," Hermione objected. The man stepped closer to the table, the light catching his features in stark relief. "There's only so much you can find from DNA. What about my findings?" Malfoy noticed Hermione's finger tighten on the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "And what have you found?" "So far, nothing conclusive, but I've only examined 2 billions of subjects. Do me the honor of helping me examine this one." He held out a pair of latex gloves to Hermione, who shook her head. "Do it, or your friend dies." He lifted his other hand, wand pointed at Draco. Hermione grabbed the gloves and pulled them over with a loud snap that echoed in the room. "I need a scalpel to start the autopsy," she said. "I'm not dumb enough to give you a weapon." The man picked up a scalpel from a tray next to him and leaned over the body to make the first incision. Malfoy used their distraction to examine his bonds. The rope was enchanted without any visible knots for him to untie. "Finite incantatem," he whispered under his breath. The bonds held tight. There was a sudden commotion at the table as the man collapsed to the floor unconscious. Hermione immediately moved to him and removed their wands from his pocket. With a practiced wave, she bound him in ropes before turning to Malfoy. "Malfoy!" "I'm okay. Would you mind?" He held out his arms, and she quickly removed the bonds from his wrists and ankles. He would never admit to the groan that he released as he stood up, everything aching unpleasantly. She handed him his wand and turned back to the killer. "You know, there's a knack to knocking someone out with a headbutt. Most people don't realize it." Hermione stood over the man, her wand pointed at him. "You know him, don't you?" "Can we get out of here before I explain?" Draco couldn't agree more and sent a Patronus to summon Auror Caxton. "Wait, you headbutted him?" "No, the victim did." She gestured to the body on the table that now sported a concave nose. Overcome with pride, Malfoy pulled her into a hug. "You continue to surprise me, Granger." She tilted her head back to look him in the eye. "Then I can't break the tradition," and pushed up on her toes to kiss him. A fizz spread through her veins from where their lips touched right down to her toes, and it overshadowed all of the dreams she'd had. He pulled her closer and with a groan deepened the kiss, licking into her mouth. "I told you they were in love!" Auror Caxton exclaimed, causing the couple to jump apart. "His name is Sven Borkson. We did our PhDs under the same professor at Johns Hopkins a few years ago." Hermione was sitting in Malfoy's office, giving her statement to Auror Caxton. "That's why it didn't appear on my list. It only showed British wizards and witches." Auror Caxton had the good grace to blush. "Make this a lesson in due diligence when doing searches, Caxton," said Malfoy from the corner of the office where he leaned against the wall. "He's brilliant, which seems to have not left him any capacity for empathy." Hermione continued, shuffling in her seat, glad that Malfoy was out of her direct eye line, and she wasn't sure she wouldn't blush if they made eye contact. Auror Caxton closed her file with a thump and looked up. "I think we can call the case closed. Boxon will not see the light of day for the rest of his life." She reached down and pulled a book from her bag. "Would you please sign my copy of your book?" She pushed it across the table to Hermione. With a blush heating her cheeks, Hermione picked up a quill and quickly signed the inside cover, then returned it to Auror Caxton, who let out a strangled squeal of excitement and shoved the book in her bag as she rushed out of the office. Hermione stood up and turned to leave. "You know, Granger, I was able to research what Bow Chicka Wow Wow actually meant." He pushed himself off the wall and invaded her space. She arched an eyebrow at him. "Did you now?" Malfoy nodded and leaned closer to her, a wicked grin on his lips. Hermione didn't give him a chance to give a snarky reply and grabbed him by the lapels to pull him into a toe-curling kiss. The end. Thank you for listening to The Magic in the Marrow by Tygermine. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, AO3, or Tumblr.